Hi, guys. Today we are looking at the article that changed my relationship with theory. If you are doing academic research and you are struggling with questions like what's your theoretical contribution? What's your theoretical lens? What is your research logic? What's the relationship between your work and existing theory? This live is for you. I'm not just going to introduce what the paper says about theory, but I'm also going to take you through the academic reading process. So this way you can also sort of get a sense of how academic writers read, and how, even though there are a lot of objective elements in what we read, there's also a lot of subjective aspects about the things that are going to speak more to us than they will to other people for whatever reasons. So I'm going to take you through some of the things that are presented in this article. It's a 1995 article, but it's an article that I still read. I read it at the start of my academic journey, and most recently I read it about a few months ago, I think, and it was for a TikTok live. And now I think that since I keep getting questions about what theory is or isn't, this is a good opportunity to discuss that. I'm going to have to apologize. We've had a lot of teething issues with YouTube Live. So this is our fifth attempt to go live. And I hope that this time it all goes well. So please bear with us in this case. And thank you to everyone who has been patient. So what theory is not? This is a paper that was written by Sutton Staw in 1995. It's published in the Administrative Science Quarterly. This is an organization theory journal. So this is one of the journals that we know, or one of the disciplines that we know organizational theories are very keen on theory, and they offer their best advice for getting people to understand what theory is or isn't. Actually, they even start off by saying if we were to try to explain what theory is or what good theory is, this will be a very difficult task because there's no consensus, there's no agreement in the literature about what actually good theory looks like. But there is agreement in the literature about five key things that everyone recognizes as important building blocks towards the establishment of theory, but they do not count as theory. So this becomes their starting point to say, okay, here are five places where a lot of people get trapped, and they think they're theorizing or they think they are providing theory, but actually they are not. So I'm going to take you through this paper, and I'm going to focus on those five things. There's a bit more that the paper does, but just because we're out of time, I'm not going to do that. I will try to go to the very last part of the paper because I think the message that they had there was a strong one. And again, for very personal, subjective reasons, I see this as important, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on it. So this paper, unlike a lot of the, let's say, conventional academic papers that we think about, usually we will go out and, I don't know if it's empirical research, we're going to collect data, and then based on this data, we're going to present something. But this is really something that is an opinion piece, and they come into it with that clarity. So they explicitly say this paper and the ideas that we present are based on our experiences as editors of this journal. And after having gone through a lot of papers that were rejected for not having theory or not having enough theory or not having good theory, we thought it was time to try to help people out by providing some kind of ideas. So they say that they describe, this is in the abstract, the differences between papers that contain some theory rather than no theory. And they also say, even though there's very limited agreement when it comes to what is strong versus weak theory, there is more consensus that these five things are not theory. So they list them: references, data, variables, diagrams, and hypotheses. So these things are not theory, and yet they see that a lot of writers use these elements in lieu of theory. So they're like, oh, if I've presented you with data, I have theory. If I show you the empirical evidence, I have theory, and it is not. So the paper just helps people to understand why these things are not therefore theory. And then in the end, they also say, so there are things that they do in the abstract that they promise to deliver on. They will explain how each of these five elements are confused or can be confused with theory, and how people can avoid such a confusion. So this was important for me because I didn't really know what theory was and what people kept asking for, because the more I gave, the more they came back and said it's not there. It was getting really, at some point, almost distressing. And then they also talk about that they really hope that it helps authors out. And for me, this was the case. It really helped me out at the start of my academic journey. And it's a paper that I still go back to. I think as I mature and as I change in my academic journey, also the kind of meaning that I append to this paper and the things that jump at me as relevant also do change. So even though the text is fixed in terms of the contents that went in there, the meaning that I'm extracting from it is changing as my own perspective about research changes and as I reach a different level of maturity with respect to that. And then they also say that they discuss how journals might facilitate the publication of stronger theory. And this part seems interesting. It's not one that I'm going to focus on. So if you find those 5 things that I present, that they present to be interesting, then I recommend that you read the paper. So it's not dense in the way that most academic texts are. And it's not, it's the kind of paper that you can read from beginning to end without doing the approach that I recommend, where you go abstract, intro, conclusion, or discussions, and then read the rest, because it's really set up in a way that you can digest each piece, and they're really trying to make the writing a bit more accessible. So again, with the start of the paper, they start by talking about that for these type of journal, everyone, the authors, the reviewers, the readers, and even the editors insist on one thing, that they have to have strong organizational theory in the articles that they accept. So this is something that everyone wants. And they say that it is a primary reason, but also sometimes the primary reason that papers get rejected. So in this case, they then talk about, okay, if we were to talk about what makes strong theory, we don't think we're going to get anywhere, because there are actually diverse views in the literature about what constitutes strong theory. They even spend some time unpacking some of the key authors or papers where they discuss what strong theory is, and then they say, you know, this is not something that we are going to be able to do. But at the same time, if we use the notion of theory in such a loose way, it's going to lose its meaning, and then it's going to become really difficult then to achieve this goal of having strong theory in this type of journal. So in this respect, they say that if we were to try to define it, it was going to make it harder, and then it was going to be harder for people to understand. So they start from the place where we make the most common mistakes in relation to what theory is or isn't, and then they present some things. And then also one of the things that I find to be interesting, I think, when they talk about what it actually takes to generate strong theory, I'm going to read these couple of sentences, right? So they say writing strong theory is time consuming and fraught with trial and error for even the most skilled organizational scholars. So it's not like even when you become a better writer, you are going to have a straight path in terms of being able to capture or develop the strong theory. And this is something that I think rings true if I look at the seasoned people that I work with that are also helping me to develop in finding my own intellectual voice. I can think of several projects where we start off thinking this is going to be the theory of interest, but then after a few iterations, we discard that theory, we move on to something else. And then after a while, we think, you know what, that theory that we discarded, there's some useful elements there. So let's go back and pull out those elements. And so we keep going and we keep working at it until we get to something that works. So even being experienced actually doesn't take away the demands that come with actually producing really good theory. And then they also say that, and this was something that I found to be reassuring in a way, right? So there are very few people who are able to do it consistently. So academic writers, they are already sitting in a very special place. It's a narrow space. If we think about how many people get a PhD, for example, that's less than 2% of the world's population. And within that less than 2% of the world's population, a small percentage are going to graduate to become academic writers for a serious number of years. And then from that small number of people who are serious writers for several years, only few are going to be able to be consistent in terms of developing the good work. So it says, okay, it's not that I am the one who is failing. It's just something that is so particularly difficult, and that very few people will have the rare opportunity to do better at. But still, they're like, okay, here are some things that we think can help you in your own journey. And based on this, you're going to be able to find things. So let's look at what they discuss in terms of what theory is not. And they pick 5 parts of an article where people usually make the biggest mistakes. So they talk about the references. References are not theory, and we're going to see how still they contribute to theory. Data are not theory, and we're going to see how they contribute to theory. And they also talk about lists of variables of constructs, not theory, but then what role do they serve? Diagrams are not theory, a personal favorite of mine, and I'm going to explain why when we get there. And then finally, hypotheses are not theory, which for me also was a bit strange because I thought hypothesizing was really about theory. But once they explain it, then it makes a lot of sense. So let's look at the 5 common places where people get trapped in terms of trying to establish a relationship between their work and theory. The first one is in referencing. And what they see usually tends to happen with referencing is that people believe that the more references that I provide, the stronger my work is in terms of theory. And they even give an example of a particular paper that one of them was editor for. An author presented a really great piece of work in terms of the empirical data that it contained, and everyone was happy about it. And then they said, but this has no theory. So you really need to strengthen your work in terms of the theory. And what the author did was go into the introduction and just throw around a lot of the big, or at least a lot of the words that suggested that there was some reference to the theory. So they explicitly referenced more theories. They cited more of the scholars that are associated with strong theory in the discipline, but it still was not good enough. And the reason that they say that this was problematic, and it starts to to get people to understand what they are going at. They are saying because there was not discussion of what these theories were about, and not discussion of the logical arguments why these theories led to the author's predictions, it still was weak in theory. So this was one of the first points in the paper where you start to see that theory is really about explanation. So it's not enough for me to give a long list of theories that are out there. It's not enough for me to cite all the people that we associate with a particular theory that I say I'm using in my research, but it's about how I'm carefully going through the different theories and interrogating the foundations of those theories and picking out, nuancing the relevant elements and holding them up against each other, and then being able, therefore, to have a basis for the arguments that I am presenting, the one or the theoretical framework that is going to inform my own research process. So this is something that they say is important. So they recognize that the references to theory help to set the stage for new conceptual arguments, is what they say. But then, and that authors need to acknowledge the stream of logic on which they are drawing and to which they are contributing. But listing references to existing theories and mentioning the names of such theories is not the same thing as explicating the causal logic that they contain. So one of the words that you will also see come up a lot is the idea of logic, or they talk about causal logic or why. But you start to see that, okay, there's a lot in this instance that relates to things that are about the logic and the explanations, right? And then after this, they go on to also talk about if this is what is actually going to happen, right? Here is what we would recommend. You have to make sure that when you cite these sources, you are actually looking at the causal arguments from these sources and then trying to bring them together to show what it is that you're trying to do and what you are testing. But they also talk about things that they don't mean, right? So this suggestion does not mean that a paper needs to review every nuance of every theory that is cited, but you must show enough of the pertinent logic. So the relevant logic for what you are trying to do. So it means that you don't need to be exhaustive in terms of unpacking what those theories are about or what the theoretical foundations are about, but you need to be very focused, hitting only those things that are going to be relevant to you. So one of the things that they even use, a term that I like there, was the idea of conceptual debt, right? I owe this particular author a particular debt in the sense that based on their earlier ideas and their explanations for this particular thing, I'm able to start my work at this point, building on what they already did. This is how I'm going to move things forward. So this notion of conceptual debt I found to be very, very interesting. And then they also talk about how if you actually do it well as an academic writer, the people who are reading your work do not need to then go and read the people that you are citing. So the importance of clarity becomes also one of the things that they emphasize. People should understand clearly enough what sort of things you're picking out from the existing knowledge by way of logical arguments, by way of explanations as to why you might have certain expectations. And then based on that, assuming you can be trusted that those things are in the text that you're citing, they don't need to then do the additional work of reading those things to understand it. So you have to make it as accessible as possible to the writers. So this was one of the first things I think that for me, I think my light bulb moment was after I made my first journal submission. And yes, we had like really good data. And then the reviewer said, this is nice. The editor said, this is nice. But they said, it's not going to fly if it doesn't have a theoretical base. So I had to then go back and try to understand what the theory was and what I was actually trying to do with my own work relevant relative to that existing knowledge or theory and what I was doing. So, what was the contribution to the already existing knowledge or the existing body of knowledge? And so, after a very long time and quite a few iterations, I was able to say, you know what, this work is really closely related to institutional theory, but it's looking at different aspects of institutional theory. So, some of them explain partially what I'm trying to do, but they don't go all the way. So, I had, for example, the three pillars of institutional logic, for which the regulatory one seemed to be important and the other two pillars were not, so I had to discard them. Then I came across what they call institutional logics, and based on that there were also some things that I could use but not all of them. And then I was able to show that relevant to what these elements of institutional theory help me in terms of explaining what I see in my data. Here are the new insights that emerge from my data that have not been previously captured in this theory. So I'm able to build something new, but also still relying or owing some debt to the people whose theoretical elements were relevant for the piece of work that I was doing. So it all takes time, I think, to get to this. If you were doing a master's dissertation, for example, I don't think you need to get that level of clarity in terms of the relationships with theory. But I think there has to be some kind of attempt at actually showing the why, the logic, the reasoning behind some of the claims that you come up in order to be able to produce a great piece of work. If you're doing a PhD, then that's much more advanced. Then your level type of argumentation should come as close as possible to, I would say, even the most ambitious journals in your own discipline. Because the idea is that if you are able to successfully defend your thesis in some settings, they're also saying this is something that is publishable. It's not necessarily that you will be able to publish it right away, but it should come close enough. So you try to mirror as much as possible the writing and what is considered to be the good writing in your discipline. And then with multiple iterations, you start to find your own voice, and then it gets really great. So that's the first thing. References are not theory unless you are able to pull out from those references the reasoning, the logical explanations, the whys that might inform your own predictions going forward into your own research. And then the second thing that they say is that data are not theory. And then they start by acknowledging, yes, empirical evidence has a really crucial role. It helps us to confirm, revise, or discredit existing theory and guides the development of new theory, right? So usually we need an empirical basis for some of the claims that we are going to make. And then they go on further to say, at the same time, we have to understand no matter how much data we have, data is going to show us which empirical patterns were observed, right? So empirically, I can tell you that this is what I see every time that we give young kids a sugary treat towards the end of the day or give them too much, they're going to get wound up and they're not going to go to bed, right? So this is an empirical fact. And this is a fact that we can replicate over and over and over again. And even if we know to expect it, unless we can explain why we see this pattern, we haven't theorized yet. So, whereas the empirical fact or observation is one that may not be denied, it's not one that people contest, the theory is the why. Why do we see these empirical patterns, right? Then we know, okay, so there's such a thing as having a sugar rush. And when they've had too much sugar in their body, then it's getting them wound up and they're not able, therefore, to wind down and go to sleep. So this is what, for me, was also important. It's like, so I have this interesting data. I have these very interesting things that I see, and they're replicated across cases. But for this to be sufficient for them by way of theoretical contribution, I have to be able to explain why I see the things that I see in the data. Why do I see certain similarities across all cases? And why do I see some unique aspects within some of the cases? And how can I explain that? So sometimes it even helps to say, I have these contradictory findings, but there might be an underlying cause that helps me to explain why they contradict each other. So even if you get really good data, and this happens with a lot of dissertations, even with master's dissertations, where sometimes master students, even undergrad students, they can collect amazing data, and it's very interesting what they find in there. But for us to be able to qualify in what ways it is interesting, in what ways it is valuable, then we have to hold it up against the mirror of the existing knowledge, right? So we have to be able to say, based on the explanations that we have got so far for this phenomenon, here is what we add to those existing explanations. Maybe we nuance something that was already there. Maybe we find an explanation that no one was even looking for, but it makes a world of difference in terms of how we are able to then understand the phenomenon or the world around us. And so in this case, it becomes very important. So they conclude by saying empirical results can really help us to get useful support for a theory, but we should not confuse them for theory. They are not enough. No matter how much we replicate them, we're going to have to do something more. Then they do something that is interesting in the paper, and I think they do it also earlier. So they talk about one of the authors of this paper, Sutton in particular, and how in their early works, they tried to motivate 5 hypotheses about the relationship between union effectiveness and union members' well-being. We don't need the context, but what they go on to give an example of is a paragraph from that writing. And then they show us that if you look at this paragraph, yes, it has these 5 elements. Yes, it is dense in terms of the citations. So I think per sentence, if I'm counting right, there's at least a couple of references that are provided. And in some sentences, after each statement and before a comma, there's a bunch of references. So it's really dense in terms of reference to other literature. But then if you look at it, it's really just describing what other people have found. And then they go back and they say, you know what, looking back, this was a mistake. It was not enough because it was just saying, here are all the empirical facts that have been observed up to this point, and based on these empirical facts, this is what we expect. But you cannot make that jump between we've made these empirical observations and therefore we expect this without understanding the explanations that underlie those empirical observations. So it is the explanations that are meant to inform what you predict about what is going to happen in a particular setting or under a particular set of circumstances. So this self-criticism for me as a novice writer was also reassuring, because I'm reading this paper about people who've made it to the top, right? They are the editors of one of the most respected journals in organizational science, and they're saying, you know what, these things that we are writing about, telling you about now, we have made the same mistakes ourselves. And they even provide the receipts. They're like, here's the whole chunk, a whole paragraph that was written in an earlier paper, and we can show you that based on this, we really presented a lot of data, but there was no explanation as to why, based on this data, we would have these expectations going forward. So again, then they start to say, we really need to explain the logical reasons why particular findings occurred in the past, or why certain empirical relationships are anticipated in the future. It's not enough to say, because we've seen enough of this here, we expect to see a bit of it there as well, right? But why would you have that expectation? There has to be an underlying logic for it. And then they call this, again, I liked like the wordplay that was in this paper. They introduced another term. This is an example of brute empiricism, where hypotheses are motivated by prior data rather than theory. So it means that if something has been missed, we're just going to pass it on into our work, because we never stop to think about why, and potentially usually contingency factors that might be driving some of the observations that we make as well. And then, even though a lot of this section was focusing on people who do quantitative research, or they're talking about hypothesis testing, they have a small paragraph dedicated to us qualitative researchers. And they say that, qualitative evidence by itself cannot convey causal arguments that are abstract and simple enough to be applied to other settings. So in the same way that for quantitative theories, they expect explanations. They say that people who use qualitative data must develop causal arguments to explain why persistent findings have been observed if they wish to write papers that contain theory. And one of the things that I was actually thinking as I was reading this, because I'm marking stuff as I read, this is me, this is what my reading looks like. But one of the questions that I get a lot from people who are still developing in terms of academic writing, and I'm still one of them, it's just that I've moved just a bit further up the line, is, okay, so I conducted interviews and I spoke to people, and I just wanted to understand what problems they were seeing in a particular setting in relation to a particular phenomenon. And then, as part of the interview, I asked them for explanations. How come you have these problems? Why is it that after X years you haven't been able to solve the problems? And then the common question that I get is, so can I report what they said were the reasons as the reasons for what is actually happening? And the simple answer there is no, because then the level at which we think about theory or theorizing is based on what we consider to be legitimate explanations that have gone through a rigorous test in order to be treated as such. We know that one of the biggest issues when it comes to our participants in research is that they do have subjectivity, right? And we do try to mitigate some of that bias in how we collect data, how we ask questions, how we diversify the sample of respondents that we're going to talk to. But we know that it's an inherent risk, and we know that it's something that is carried there. So if I wanted a legitimate explanation for what I was seeing, I cannot solely rely on an individual's own interpretation or on thinking about what the drivers are. And especially in crisis situations, right, the blame game is quite common. You know, this isn't working because manager B in the other department isn't doing their job. And then you ask manager B and they say it's not working because manager D is not doing their job. And so if I were to take that as authoritative by way of explanation, and I presented that as an explanation, one, it's too specific, it's linked to that particular empirical context, and two, we know it's going to likely have bias. So when we talk about theory and we talk about explanations, we are looking within the academic space or within the academic realm, and we are relying on the conventions that have been used over an extended period of time to say these are the explanations that we get for things. And so this is why when we write academic papers, we get to the discussion section, we still come back to the literature, right? So with our methods, yes, there's the methods literature that we're going to cite. With our results, depending on what we choose to do and where we choose to put things, sometimes there's zero references in the results because we're just saying here's what we found and here's what the patterns look across, let's say, different cases that we have studied. But then for us to then be able to find explanations for that, we are going to have to go back to the literature. We have to hold up those findings against the mirror that is the existing knowledge and look at the theories and scan it and say, you know, okay, maybe based on this theory, this explanation is still valid, excuse me, but then if I look at what I find and what the explanations are, they don't fit, and then I might have to find something new. So this also for me was important. Like, okay, why wouldn't I just pass on the explanations that I was given by my respondents as the whys to the phenomenon that I'm interested in? Because that part actually does have to be removed from the subjective self, not just on the part of the respondents, but even the researchers, because we do hold certain views or opinions as researchers, and the use of theory or depending on the other tried and tested knowledge then actually helps us in a way to lay aside our biases or to God. And no matter how much no matter how much data I've got, the data do not generate theory. Only researchers do that. So yes, I can get the data and that data is going to tell me something, and the respondents that I talk to are going to speculate or even tell me with great confidence what the reasons are because they are sure of those reasons, but it's still part of the data, right? I, as the researcher, is going to have to do a bit more work before I can generate the theory, the explanations underlying the empirical facts or observations that I get out of the data. So the role of the researcher in terms of theorizing is one that is quite important, that is quite crucial, and it's something that you have to learn to become comfortable with. I think in the very early stages of my career, and I still have it now, it's one of the things that, like, okay, who am I? I'm just Noni. Why would I be sitting here criticizing the explanations that were done by some of the greatest people that I know, in term just based on reading their work and what I hear people who know them say about them, and I'm just here knowing nothing. But over time it does get better, you get that confidence, and I think the one of the things that makes it easier is when you actually understand that all we are trying to do in the academic space is to improve the quality of the existing knowledge. So just already understanding that I am standing on the shoulders of giants, right? I am starting from a place where someone did a lot of the hard work, so that I just have to do a bit more to push the quality of the knowledge just that bit much higher. That makes it easier. And it also makes it easier for me also as a researcher whose work is going to be criticized, right? So I don't take it that personally if I'm an anonymous reviewer and someone has some not so pleasant things to say about my work, it's like, okay, if there's a fair point and it does improve the state of knowledge, this is something that I should be open to. And that's something that I try to do. So we've looked at this now, why data are not theory, and the sort of things that you have to do to establish then that link, or at least to use the data in an effective way as part of the theorizing journey. Point number 3, they say lists of variables or constructs are not theory. And this for me was very interesting because I think within my own discipline, we're not particularly good at theory. And I think some of the seasoned researchers in my own discipline will also agree with that. It hasn't been until, I don't know, maybe the last decade or so that we started to understand the distinction. But I do remember also at the start of my PhD journey that we used to have what we would call concepts, or what I would understand as concepts now, as theories. And one classical example is a bullwhip effect. So the bullwhip effect is a very common phenomenon that plays across in all kinds of supply chains, and it also has proven to be true over time and across contexts. But they say that if you have fluctuations in demand at the end part of the supply chain. So think about, your supermarket trips that you do every weekend. So every weekend people go out and they buy stuff. And right now it's summertime. And depending on what the weather is like, we might buy more or less ice cream or whatever it is that we need for the house. And then when people further up the supply chain receive an order from the supermarkets, that data doesn't have context. It just says, I don't know, we want more ice cream this time. And they might start to speculate as to why there's an increase in demand, and then they're going to build a bit of buffer into their order so that they're prepared for the next orders. But then if everyone, as you go further upstream of the supply chain, is creating this buffer just based on the order quantity, it means that what started off as a very small disturbance on the end part of the supply chain, like, oh, it was a bit hotter than usual, then people got a few more cool drinks than usual, but it's not the typical patterns. Everyone else further upstream of the supply chain has created this huge effect. So it looks like a bullwhip when you look at it, because the propagation is such that those waves get worse as you go further up with the supply chain. So the bullwhip effect itself is an empirical fact. It's replicated. It's a phenomenon. We expect it wherever there are supply chains where information is not properly shared, or what we call not well integrated supply chains. But it's not a theory in itself. It's just an empirical fact. And we can explain what we observe in terms of those empirics. But then to be able to theorize, we are going to have to be able to offer explanations as to what actually happens. So this confusion of constructs with theory or concepts with theory is one of the things that I'm still learning about, because in my discipline, this is entirely different. We seem to treat them interchangeably almost. But what they say, which I appreciate, and probably I missed it the first few times that I read this, a theory must also explain why variables or constructs come about, or why they are connected. So with the bullwhip effect, right, it's not enough to say we are just going to get worse fluctuations across the supply chain in terms of how much demand is there and how much buffer stocks people hold across the supply chain, right? Because that is what we see. But why do we see this? Well, that's because there's not enough information, and we know that people, whenever they forecast, they tend to always build in the buffers in terms of the numbers. So if they don't have enough context, it's a very typical bias that is in them to expect that the next order is going to be bigger than the last one, and so they're going to behave in this particular way. And yet, if you would have enough information within the supply chain, then you will be able to mitigate this effect. So they say that, yes, we get papers that are written as if the well-defined variables or constructs by themselves are enough to make theory. So while all these things are good, they're actually not important. At the end of the day, you really have to have an explanation of that variable. Why? How come? So in the end, they talk about all the things that you really cannot consider to be theory. They're just lists, they're variables, they're constructs, and that, a predicted relationship must be explained to provide a theory. So just to say, okay, A is going to cause B is not enough. Just to say, because we've seen A and B in different places and we know that if we bring them here, it's going to be A causes B, that's not enough. There has to be an explanation as to why we would actually expect this. Then we're in the realm of theorizing. So they also talk about how these variables or constructs in a way actually allow us to break things down into smaller chunks. It helps us to break theory down into more manageable chunks, and we can break it down into small elements that we can treat in different ways. But it's really not going to be theory unless we can provide these explanations and also show how they are linked as well. So they close with a statement where they say the key issue is why a particular set of variables are expected to be strong predictors of a particular phenomenon. So by this point, I'm in the third one. You can already see that it's really about the explanation. It's about the logic that underlies our expectations about particular results. If you're not able to pin a logic to those expectations, you haven't started engaging with theory yet, because it's kind of wherever, right? And maybe some of it is valid. Yes, we have consistently seen this play out, but really there has to be a why before you can be able to say that I have theory or I have some theory in my work. And then the fourth one is my favorite. Diagrams are not theory. I loved this because I'm really bad at drawing diagrams in academic writing. I've had a few publications out now at this point, and only my first publication had a diagram in it after the literature review, where I said, okay, here's my conceptual framework, and here are all the important elements that I see there, and some of the, in a very loose way, relationships that I expect or would like to explore within this particular piece of research. That diagram took up so much of my time. It was partly anxiety inducing, it was partly distressing, that when I saw that diagrams are not theory and I don't have to draw a diagram just to show what the relationships are, I was like, then I'm not doing it again. So if you ever see a paper in which I'm involved and there's a diagram at the end of section 2, I had no hand in it. I just absolutely cannot do it. But here are some of the things that they present that made a lot of sense to me. And I think they mirror what I do now as part of having understood what this distinctions are. So they start by saying, diagrams, they can be helpful. So figures that show causal relationships in a logical ordering helps readers to see a chain of causation, or how a third variable intervenes in or moderates a relationship. So this visual is usually important for people, right? What are your left-hand side variables? What are your right-hand side variables? Are they mediators in the middle or moderators that affect this relationship? All of this is important for people, and to be able to see it in one place is nice. So even though I'm really bad at them, I do appreciate it when I see them. And then they say, now this is the word choice is so important that I have to read this out to you, right? And maybe it's because it leans towards my own weaknesses with diagrams in academic writing. I really picked that up on it. I picked up on this on occasion, on occasion. So it's not usually, it's not typically, it's not most of the times, on occasion. So rarely, sometimes, right? Diagrams they can. It's not that they are, it's not that they must be, but they can be a useful aid in building theory. So there will be very limited instances in our academic existence where a diagram actually served a useful role in theory building. That was so liberating for me. I was like, okay, given how rare it is anyway to find people who can do those things so well, I accept that I'm not one of them, And I'm happy to not have to draw a conceptual framework or theoretical framework at the end of a literature review section, because I just can't do it. It costs me too much time. But it's also important to note that they are also making the argument that you still have to be able to articulate verbally what the key relationships are. So this is what I do by way of introducing a conceptual framework at the end of my literature review sections. So after introducing these variables and showing some of the shortcomings or key sub questions emerging when I look at different parts of the literature, I have to bring it all together. So your conceptual framework is your so what, right? Now that you have showed us all these gaps, you have described all these shortcomings, what are we taking away from it? And the conceptual framework is that now I bring all these things together and I say, okay, all these variables or concepts or constructs are important, and they will be related in some way in terms of what I specify as an outcome variable. And then there will be some relationships that I explore. But rather than draw them, I'd rather verbalize them. I would rather say, okay, it's important to understand these relationships potentially between these particular factors and how this might intervene or actually change outcomes in a particular way, and with reasons why it will be important to actually explore that. So why do we expect it, or why is it important for us to understand it if we don't know which way those relationships are going to go? Because that's kind of what I do with exploratory research. And then they say, regardless of their merits, diagrams and figures should be considered as stage props rather than the performance itself, right? They're props. They're not even the supporting actor. They don't even have a supporting role. They're just a prop. It helps with the aesthetics of a paper. Like, really, when we read papers and their diagrams, it does feel good. And we do usually dwell on them for a bit, but it's just a prop. It's not the main thing, and you can leave without it. So once I did this, I set myself free. So what I do now, and they explain it, a clearly written argument should also preclude the need for the most complicated figures we see in articles, those more closely resembling a complex wiring diagram than a comprehensible theory. It's really difficult, especially I think in my case, because a lot of what I do is exploratory research, and there will be some moving parts even on the front end. It doesn't become clear until I get into my data. To try to present that visually is really, really difficult. I don't know how many versions of the final diagram I had in the only paper that has a diagram at the end of section 2, but that was enough for me to know if I can avoid this, I'm not doing it, and I haven't done it. So in the end, it's really about being able to show, what really is that you're able to say verbally. But they also, in all fairness, so putting my own bias and my own issues with diagrams aside, good theory is usually representational. So in terms of the figures and the diagrams, and verbal. So people who are good at it are able to verbalize it, and they're also able to present an illustrative figure to actually show what is going on. One indication that a strong theory has been proposed is that it is possible to discern conditions in which the major proposition or hypothesis is most and least likely to hold. So they're already speaking of contingency factors in terms of how we build good research, or how we have good theory, and knowing that, okay, if this happens, then we can expect that. Or I've now done all this work, this is what I conclude, but I can imagine that if you change this one factor, you might get an entirely different result. So this sort of sets the boundaries within which we can expect a particular theory to be useful and to inform even practice in a way. So this was one of the things that for me was the best part of the paper, just knowing I don't have to draw diagrams. I can just verbalize things, and I would rather work on improving my prose, how I write, than spend another day trying to draw a diagram that shows the causal relationships that I'm interested in. So this might be something that also you can check for yourself, like with all the papers that you read in your own discipline, how many of them culminate in an actual diagram of the relationships that are there. If I think about my own discipline, and maybe there's a bias, but I think in earlier years it was almost standard practice to have a diagram in section 2 in the literature review, what people used to call the conceptual framework. Some people would even call it the initial framework. And then on the back end, after the discussion, and they have done some things and they have gotten some results, they also would have sometimes, not always, but they would have come up with what they called a revised framework. So based on the research process that we have done and this newly acquired understanding of the relationships, we alter this framework to represent what we now understand to be the real relationships at play. And I love those papers, but I'm not going to be one of the people writing them. I'm content to just admire them and leave it at that. Then we get to the final one, which is interesting in itself, hypotheses. So they say hypotheses or predictions are not theory. So when I saw this, I had to lean back and be like, hypotheses are not theory? I thought all we do with hypothesizing is actually theorizing. And then they say, well, actually, hypotheses can serve as crucial bridges between theory and data, making explicit how the variables and the relationships that follow from a logical argument will be operationalized. So they see some kind of difference in this respect. And then they say that what you will see, and then when they say this, I saw it, right? It was always in front of my eyes, but I had never seen it until I read it in this paper. Hypotheses do not and should not contain logical arguments about why empirical relationships are expected to occur. And if you have done any type of hypothesis testing or written any type of paper where you had to formulate hypotheses, this is true. We just will usually say A causes B, maybe via D, right? But we are not going to say A causes B because no. So hypotheses are really succinct, precise statements about what we expect to occur. We expect that A is going to lead to B, but we do not give out any information as to why we have this expectation. And they say, and this is also true for me. So if you've ever seen a hypothesis that was formulated with an explanation as to why that expectation was there, call me up because I haven't seen that. We cannot find a single source that asserts that hypotheses or other specific predictions alone constitute theory, right? And then they go on to talk about then the things that you need to do. Sorry, just a second. Okay, so in the end, because this is the way that the hypotheses are usually set up, we cannot confuse them for theory. So by construction, by definition, how we set up hypotheses means that they're not theory because they're just statements about expected relationships. And yes, underlying those statements, we have to feed in the logic, and they start earlier. So one of the examples that they gave when they were saying that it was the second one. So where they were saying that data are not theory, right? So they give the example of saying we have all these empirical facts that is replicated across multiple settings. Therefore, we expect that we will see the same empirical, let's say, fact at play, or we will observe the same patterns as those before us have. And so it's not enough. So usually when we hypothesize, the statements themselves are not theory, but at least the reasons that underlie those statements should have engaged with theory to a certain extent. And they then talk about some of the issues that they see with research that uses hypothesis testing that has not really engaged with theory. So they say there are telltale signs that we see when a paper has presented hypotheses in lieu of theory. And then the first is that There are so many hypotheses that none can be adequately explained or motivated. So if you are doing a hypothesis testing research, and their argument is if you would actually have a good theoretical basis, you are not going to need that many hypotheses, because the theoretical basis is going to inform it, and you're going to be kind of more confident in terms of the ones that you pick as potentially relevant, and you're going to run with them, and you're going to see what actually comes out of it. Then they say the second tip off is that when the introduction of a paper ends with a long list of hypotheses or table of predictions or summarizing figure, then it also means that, okay, people really don't know what they're doing yet. Then they don't understand what I would say, what's the relationship between your work and existing theory. So in the end, they say, we know that people are hedging, they just want to spread the risk because, I don't know, some of these things, if you're doing experimental work, it costs a lot to run those experiments, and you want at least one of the results to come out positive, because if it doesn't, then it's a lot of work that goes down the drain that no one is ever going to know about, because only the important or interesting results are going to get published. In academia, actually, they even talk about the problem of, is it the file drawer system, where we have a lot of these amazing works, or could have been amazing works, but we missed a turn, maybe in terms of the data that we collected, or I don't know, sometimes it's even the opportunity, the window within which we did certain things. Maybe someone beat us to a publication, and then our work wasn't novel anymore. But every researcher has this long stack of papers that are never going to go anywhere, because there was a miss at a certain point, and some of it relates to, or maybe most of it relates to, the data. Did you get sufficient data? Did you get good data? Did you get relevant data? If you fail to do that and the window closes on fixing that, then this is just going to be another could have been project, but that's all that it is ever going to be. I'm at the early stages of my career. My pile is already this high. I don't know what more senior people actually have then in relation to that. So they say in the end, papers with strong theory usually start with one or two conceptual statements. It's not a lot. And then they build a logically detailed case, because it's engaging with the explanations, with the whys. And then they have both simplicity and interconnectedness. And this is something that I'm still learning. So for me, simplicity, it's not something that comes naturally. Actually, I have the tendency to make things complicated. And then just learning that, okay, if I have a powerful idea and it's competing with many other ideas, one of the things that I do now as a first task is to try to isolate, like, which idea is the powerful one. So like trying for myself consciously to build a hierarchy of the ideas, or even when I'm analyzing data, right, I try to create a hierarchy. Which are the most important insights that are coming out from this data? And then I'm going to pick only the top ones, and I'm going to focus on them. I could still tell a lot, because I find a lot of things, but usually by the third or fourth one, the others are not so valuable, and they just create noise, and they create clutter around what would have otherwise been a good story theoretically. So as a result, I'm learning to say, okay, we keep it simple. We find and isolate the really big, really valuable idea. And if I insist on it, which I tend to do, two maybe, but not three. And then I really try to work with that and try to bring out, like, show what is valuable in it. And then everything else kind of falls off. So there are a lot of things that don't make the cut in terms of publications. But then what it means is that the stuff that I write is easier for people to connect with, like running with one big idea and presenting it in simple ways and showing quite concretely what the connections are. So the more you reduce, let's say, the variables that you use in a particular research, or you reduce the hypotheses that you use if you're hypothesis testing, one of the natural consequences is that you have enough word space for more depth and for more nuance for those things that you're introducing. So it's easier to find the word space to build the arguments that are going to convince people that, this is something that is so important, and this is something that we can engage with. So they go on to talk about things like, okay, then what do we do to identify strong theory? I recommend you do it, you read it. They also talk about the case against theory. So they're like, okay, although we are calling for strong theory, we will acknowledge that there are people out there who don't think that we need strong theory. They even give examples of people who say in the first stages of research or when a topic is nascent, we shouldn't even be thinking about theory at all. We should be collecting the observations and learning something from them. And then after we have acquired a certain level of understanding, then we can start to theorize, but we shouldn't actually be combining the two. So they acknowledge those people and then they leave quite a few question marks for people to explore it. And now, finally, that's all that I'm going to be able to do. I'm just going to go to the conclusion because they say something that is so powerful. And I think it's something that, unfortunately, even though this is in 1995 and they're trying to make a case for being careful about what we consider to be valuable, because I think increasingly it's the case in my discipline, it's the case in disciplines of friends that I know who are academics. There's such a huge emphasis placed on how much data you've got, right? So I see papers that get rejected because maybe the most extreme example is that I once was a reviewer for a paper where the researchers had 80 interviews, 80. And when I saw that, I mean, as a qualitative researcher who works with really, really difficult contexts, one of the things that I did was compliment them like, wow, 80 interviews. This is amazing. This is great. And then, of course, there were still issues with the paper fundamentally that meant that I was not ready to recommend and accept or major revision. But I tried to be supportive, like, encouraging you have really good data, do take the time. I hope one day I'm going to be able to see this and I can read it. There was one reviewer who said, but you have only 80 interviews. And I was thinking, no, it's not only 80 interviews. Actually, this is rare. So sometimes some of it has to do with the different disciplines or the different methods. I think quants people in general are expected to do more. If you do surveys, you need hundreds or thousands of observations. But if you do interviews, it's a bit different. And sometimes this gets lost in terms of what we consider important. But anyway, I'm going to read this because I think it's such an important statement in Sutton and Staw's 1995 paper, What Theory Is Not. In closing, we ask the reader to consider whether the evidence provided by people such as Freud, Marx, or Darwin would meet the empirical standards of the top journals in organizational research. Will their work be rejected outright, or will they be given the opportunity to go through several rounds of revision? Just thinking about such a question brings forth the essential role of balance or tolerance in evaluating research. When theories are particularly interesting or important, there should be greater leeway in terms of empirical support. A small set of interviews, a demonstration experiment, a pilot survey, a bit of archival to be true. So in the end, I think this is a very, very important topic because I come across it now as I start to review some articles or try to get some initial ideas out, that always is this demand like, okay, but where's your empirical base, where's your data? As far as I am concerned, I think in most cases, whenever researchers have gone farther than anyone else has, this is enough for us to be able to say, yes, it's just 8 interviews, but that's 8 more than anyone else has ever been able to produce. It gives us some initial insights, it kickstarts our processes, it brings more eyes on the subjects and gets more minds working hard to try to crack this puzzle. And so as a result, yes, top journals, if any one of you is out there, please stop rejecting papers because they don't have enough data. I think some of the ideas that people present and how hard it is to get that data actually means that we still have some important things going on. So I close with that. But here you go. Sutton installs what theory is not, and the 5 things that we tend to confuse theory for, and how you can use those things as a way of strengthening your own theory in your own work, rather than using it to work against you because you still are not making those connections with the why certain questions. I can stick around just to address the questions, but so far I don't see anything in the chat. So I don't know if we have any questions. Kadleho, thank you so much for joining. It's so good to see you. I don't see any questions. So I think this is it. We can call it a day. It was a bit of a nightmare. I think it was attempt number 5 or 6 that we were finally able to go live on YouTube. So I hope next time it gets easier, but who knows? So thanks to everyone who's joined us, especially this late. And thanks, Katleho, because I know you followed us through all the streams that didn't quite work. So that's really, really appreciated. Thank you, guys. So this is it for tonight. If you're just coming, we just finished talking about what theory is not. So reading one of what I consider to be the classics on unpacking and demystifying theory. And if you are struggling with theory in your academic writing, I'm going to make this available immediately after streaming. You can watch it back at your own leisure and see if there's anything there that helps a few light bulbs to come on. And otherwise, happy reading and happy writing.